Sinead O'Connor understood anger the way surgeons understand the body. From the inside, with precision, knowing exactly where to cut and what would happen when she did. She had built a career out of it, not the blunt, undirected kind that burned itself out in 3 minutes and left nothing behind. The other kind, the anger that had done its thinking, that had traced itself back to its source and understood what it was actually about, that arrived in a song or on a stage already knowing what it intended to accomplish. She had ripped up a photograph of the Pope on live television in front of 20 million people and sat with the consequences without flinching, without apologizing, without softening the gesture into something more palatable after the fact. She had written "Nothing Compares to You" and sung it with a face that showed everything. And the showing had been a choice, not an accident. She was 30 years old by 1993. She had survived things that would have ended other careers twice over and was still standing, still recording, still saying the things that rooms full of important people wished she would stop saying. She was not someone who needed to be told what she was doing. She had been told repeatedly by people who believed their telling was a form of help, and she had heard them out and continued doing exactly what she had been doing before they spoke, which was the only honest response she knew how to give. She had heard Nirvana the way she heard everything she considered worth hearing, with full attention, without the protective layer of critical distance that most people use to keep powerful things at arm's length. Nevermind had arrived and she had sat with it, felt the velocity of it, understood the rage underneath it as something genuine rather than performed. She respected that. Genuine rage was rare. Most of what passed for it was theater. The posture of rebellion without the wound underneath. She thought she understood what Kurt Cobain was. She was partly right, which is sometimes more dangerous than being entirely wrong. The circumstances that brought them into the same space in 1993 were loose in the way things always were in that world. A mutual connection, an overlap of schedules, the small geography of an industry that was, despite its surface vastness, a series of concentric circles where certain people kept finding themselves in the same rooms without having planned it. It was not a formal meeting. It was not an interview or a collaboration or anything that had a name attached to it afterward. It was just a room, and both of them in it. Sinead found him the way she found most things, directly without the social preamble that other people used to warm up a conversation. She was Irish in the specific way that meant she had no patience for the long way around a sentence. She looked at him, and she saw what she always saw when she looked at someone who was making the kind of noise he was making. The anger, clear and present, unmistakable. And underneath the anger, the question she had learned to ask about everyone who carried it that visibly. What is it actually about? She said something along these lines, not cruelly, not as a challenge in the way challenges are sometimes dressed up as questions. As a genuine inquiry, she wanted to know because she had spent years asking the same question of herself, and the asking had produced the work that she was most proud of. She said, "Anger is not enough on its own. You have to know what it's for. What is yours for?" She expected engagement. She had asked this question before, and it always produced something. Pushback or agreement, or the beginning of a real conversation about the difference between noise and meaning, between the performance of feeling and the thing itself. Kurt looked at her for a moment. He said, "I'm not sure it's anger." She waited. He didn't elaborate. She started to say something else, and he had already looked away. Not rudely, not dismissively, but in the way of someone whose interior conversation had resumed and was pulling his attention back inward. The exchange was over. It had lasted perhaps 40 seconds. She thought about what he had said for the rest of the evening and did not arrive at anything she could hold on to. "I'm not sure it's anger." What did that mean? She was sure it was anger. She had heard Nevermind, had felt the distortion and the velocity and the scream that arrived at the end of certain passages, like something that had been held back until it couldn't be anymore. What else could you call that? She filed the exchange and moved on. This was what she did with things that didn't resolve cleanly. Not discarded, not forgotten, but placed somewhere in the back of the mind where they could continue working without demanding her immediate attention. She had a great deal of material filed this way. Most of it eventually yielded something. Some of it did not. The show was 3 days later. It's three. Not a stadium. A venue that held a few hundred people at most. The kind of room that had no distance built into it, where the stage was low enough that you could see the sweat on a performer's face from the middle of the crowd, where the sound had nowhere to go except directly into the bodies of the people standing in it. Sinead was there. She had not been certain she would go. She went. She stood toward the back. This was deliberate. She had learned long ago that the back of a room gave you something the front couldn't, a view of the whole rather than the part. The ability to watch the crowd watch the performer and understand from the crowd's body what was actually happening on the stage. Nirvana walked on without ceremony. She had seen thousands of performers walk onto thousands of stages. She had learned to read the walk, what it told you about what was coming, about the relationship between the person and the performance they were about to give. Some people walked on like they were arriving somewhere they owned. Some walked on like they were trying to disappear into the instrument before the crowd could fix them in place. Some walked on performing the casualness of not performing, which was its own kind of performance and usually the most exhausting kind to sustain. Kurt walked on and she could not read it. This was unusual enough to make her pay a different quality of attention. He stood at the microphone and looked at the room, and the room looked back, and the silence before the first note lasted a beat longer than it needed to. Not for effect, simply because he was not yet ready, and he did not pretend to be ready before he was. Then they began. The first song hit her the way the album had. The velocity, the distortion, the drums arriving like something structural had given way. She had expected this. She had braced for it in the specific way she had learned to brace for things she had already categorized. The part of the mind that says, I know what this is, and settles into recognition. She was good at recognition. She had spent years developing the capacity to identify quickly what something was and how it worked and what it was trying to do. And the capacity had served her well in most situations she had encountered. The recognition lasted about 30 seconds, because underneath the velocity was something she had not heard on the record, or had heard and not understood as a separate thing from the velocity itself. The voice was doing something that the production of Nevermind had contained, had shaped, had run through the machinery of a professional recording, and delivered at a controlled temperature. In this room, at this distance, with the sound hitting her chest directly and no intermediary between her and the source, the voice was not controlled. Not raw in the way people use that word to mean unfinished, complete in a different direction than finished. She had spent years learning to be honest in her music, had gone to places in her writing and recording that she knew were genuinely dangerous to visit, had opened things that didn't close easily, had let the camera see things that people generally kept out of frame. She knew what that cost. She knew the specific quality of what it felt like to be actually honest rather than performing honesty. And she knew the difference because she had done both, and the difference was enormous. What she was hearing from the stage was not what she had asked him about 3 days earlier. It was not anger. She understood this now in the way you understand things that arrive through the body rather than through the mind. Not as a conclusion reached by reasoning, but as a fact that was simply suddenly present. The way temperature is present, the way gravity is present. It was not anger. Anger had a direction. Anger knew what it was against and moved toward it or away from it, and the movement gave it its shape. What was coming from the stage had no direction in that sense. It was not against anything. It was not for anything. It simply was, with a completeness that needed nothing outside itself to justify its existence. She had asked him what his anger was for. He had said, I'm not sure it's anger. She had filed this and moved on. She did not file it anymore. The set continued and she stood in it and stopped taking notes in the part of her mind that always took notes and simply let the thing be what it was without requiring it to be anything she could use. This was not something she did easily. She was a person who processed experience into meaning almost involuntarily, who took what happened and turned it into the next song, the next statement, the next thing she needed to say. The processing was how she survived. It was also how she made the work. For the duration of that set, she could not process it. It was happening too fast and too completely, and in a direction she did not have a map for. She was aware of this as it was happening, aware of the part of her mind that usually took notes going quiet. Not because the note-taking had decided to stop, but because it had encountered something that did not reduce to notes. This happened rarely. She could count on one hand the number of times in her life she had stood in the presence of something that refused to be processed into usefulness while she was still inside the experience of it. When it ended, she stood in the silence after the last note and felt the crowd return to itself around her and realized her face was wet in a way she had not noticed while it was happening. She did not wipe her eyes. She stood there until the lights came up, and then she left without speaking to anyone. She thought about what she had heard for a long time after that night. What she eventually arrived at, slowly and without complete satisfaction, and the slowness mattered because she was not a person who arrived at things slowly. And the fact that this one required time was itself information about the nature of the thing was something like this. She had spent her career learning to weaponize truth, to take the thing that was real and point it at the thing that was wrong, and use the precision of the honesty as the instrument of the argument. It was powerful. It had worked. It had cost her things she still counted sometimes in the quiet of a sleepless night. What she had heard from that stage was truth that had not been weaponized, that had not been pointed at anything, that existed without the intention to wound or to correct or to make anyone feel the weight of what they had done or failed to do. It was the rarest kind, truth that had no agenda except to be itself and was therefore somehow larger than any truth she had managed to make useful. She had told him anger was not enough. He had to know what it was for. She understood now that she had asked the wrong question entirely. Kurt Cobain died in April 1994. Sinead O'Connor had her own catastrophic year not long after. A year that tested the limits of what a person could survive publicly and continue. She survived it. She continued. She kept making music that said the things that rooms full of important people wished she would stop saying because that was what she knew how to do, and she had never found a reason to stop. Sinead O'Connor spoke about Kurt Cobain carefully in the years that followed, and rarely. When she did, she was precise in the way she was always precise. No excess, no sentiment that wasn't earned. She said once in a conversation that was not intended to be widely quoted but was, "There are people who find the truth and use it, and there are people who simply are it. I always thought the first was the harder thing. I was wrong about that." She did not say his name. She did not need to. The thing she had asked him 3 days before the show, "What is your anger for?" had seemed to her at the time like the most important question you could ask someone who was making the kind of noise he was making. She had asked it of herself early and often, and the asking had sharpened everything she subsequently made. It was a good question. It had produced good answers. He had given her a better one. "I'm not sure it's anger." 5 words, 40 seconds. A door she had not known was there, opening onto something she spent the rest of her working life trying to understand and never fully did, which was perhaps the point and perhaps the gift, and perhaps the only honest thing either of them ever gave the other.